The farmer placed an enormous enslaved man as a human scarecrow in the plantation. But this time events unfolded differently, and nothing on that property would ever return to its former state. Out on Franklin Patterson's Alabama farm, deep in the interior, the ritual of the human scarecrow had long been a practiced habit. When an enslaved person committed what the farmer deemed disobedience, the pattern followed nearly the same course each time. First came the pillory and the lash until flesh split open, then 3 or 4 days bound to a post in the center of the plantation, without sustenance, without water, exposed to sun and rain alike. When they finally brought down the nearly lifeless man, there remained one final beating, extra lashes simply to drive the point home. It wasn't merely discipline, it was a declaration. Franklin enjoyed having people from the surrounding region observe from the road a body suspended in the midst of the corn. To fellow farmers, it demonstrated his authority. To the enslaved, it illustrated the fate of those who dared to lift their heads. Patterson's farm carried a reputation that extended across 3 counties. When his name came up in town taverns, other planters would shake their heads with a blend of respect and unease. Franklin had a name as a firm-handed man, a polite label for someone who had elevated cruelty to a system. He had taken over the estate from his father at 25, along with 43 enslaved individuals and 200 acres of quality land for cotton and corn. Over the next 15 years, he grew to 87 enslaved people and doubled his acreage. His formula, as he liked to repeat while drinking with fellow owners, was straightforward. Never allow any of them to forget, even for an instant, who holds authority here. The post in the cornfield's center wasn't ornamental. It was educational. Franklin had installed it in his 2nd year of running the farm, after a young enslaved man named Samuel attempted escape and was captured 3 days later, starving and disoriented in the swamp. Franklin wasn't content with merely whipping him. He ordered that structure, cross-shaped, erected right in the most visible part of the plantation, and hung Samuel there for 5 full days. The young man didn't survive. He perished on the 4th day, still tied up beneath the August sun. Franklin directed them to leave the body another full day before permitting it to be taken down. So the lesson sinks in, he told the overseers. After that, the post remained vacant for months, yet its presence lingered constantly in the minds of everyone who worked those fields. It was a silent oath of what might come. In the years that followed, the post saw use at least once annually, sometimes twice, never for offenses that white law would consider serious. A man who argued with an overseer, a woman seen speaking with enslaved people from another farm, a boy who stole an apple from the orchard. Each time the ritual repeated. Whipping, days without food or water, and then the final beating for whoever still possessed the strength to feel pain. Most survived, but none emerged whole. Some lost fingers to the cold of winter nights. Others developed fevers that never fully lifted. Many bore scars not just across their backs, but within their souls. A profound and immobilizing terror that stopped them from meeting any white person's gaze for the remainder of their lives. Franklin employed 3 main overseers. The eldest and most vicious was Silas Green, a gaunt man with hollow eyes and a sparse mustache who seemed to derive genuine pleasure from others' suffering. Silas had begun as an overseer at 18, working for Franklin's father, and now at 40. 2 was practically part of the farm's fixtures. He knew every corner of the property, every possible hiding spot, every concealed path the enslaved used to move about unseen from the big house. The other 2 overseers, Horace and Ezekiel, were younger and less seasoned, but they learned swiftly from Silas. Horace was large and dull, the sort who followed orders without reflection and favored force, because it was the sole thing he excelled at. Ezekiel was different. Thin, jittery, perpetually chewing tobacco, with a sidelong way of looking that made everyone uncomfortable. He didn't strike for pleasure like Silas, but out of fear. Fear of losing his position, fear of appearing weak, fear of Franklin. Together, the three maintained a surveillance system that seemed to cover every moment of the day. Silas patrolled the main fields. Horace handled the barns and storage areas, and Ezekiel was responsible for the area near the slave quarters and the path to the big house. There were irregular night shifts, deliberately unpredictable, so no one would know when it was safe to move after dark. Gideon represented the worst kind of enslaved person for a man like Franklin. Tall, powerful, over 2 meters in height, broad shoulders, arms like tree trunks. The whites called him the giant. Among the enslaved, he was seen as a protector, someone who placed himself in front when the overseer came after a child or an elder. He wasn't insolent, but neither was he entirely broken. And that, for Franklin and his chief overseer Silas Green, was already a threat. Gideon had been purchased 5 years earlier at a Montgomery auction. Franklin needed strong men to clear a new planting area, fell thick trees, and pull out deep stumps. The auctioneer had announced Gideon as an exceptional specimen, 23 years old, strength of 3 men, suitable for heavy labor. The opening bid was steep, but Franklin didn't hesitate. He saw in that body the potential to expand production without purchasing 2 or 3 ordinary enslaved people. In the early months, Gideon worked in silence. He cut more wood than anyone else, carried logs that required 2 men to lift, dug deep ditches with remarkable speed. Silas, who typically found reasons to punish newcomers, found nothing amiss. Gideon carried out every order, didn't complain, avoided eye contact with whites, kept his head lowered. Yet something about him disturbed them. Perhaps it was that even with his head down, his presence was impossible to overlook. When Gideon entered a room or approached a group, people took notice. His size created a kind of gravity all its own, and worse, the other enslaved people began to gather near him. Not overtly, but organically. Gideon became a focal point. The first time Silas noticed this was during a dispute between 2 men over a tool. The argument was escalating, and Silas was already approaching with whip in hand, prepared to distribute lashes and conclude matters as they always concluded. But before he arrived, Gideon positioned himself between the 2 men, said something low that Silas couldn't hear, and the fight simply ceased. The 2 separated, collected their tools, and returned to work. Silas stood there holding the whip uselessly. There was no direct defiance. No one had challenged him, but he sensed that something wrong had occurred. Someone had resolved a problem before him, and that couldn't become routine. After that, Silas began observing Gideon more closely. He noticed that children approached him without fear, that elderly women asked him to carry heavy items, and he always helped that men spoke with him in low voices during the few minutes of rest. None of this was prohibited, yet all of it built something Silas recognized as dangerous: respect. Gideon was becoming a leader without even trying. That was when Silas started seeking pretexts. Small matters at first. Had Gideon taken a few extra seconds to follow an order? Had he looked the wrong way? Was he working slowly, deliberately? Silas reported these observations to Franklin during evening conversations on the big house porch, always accompanied by whiskey. "That giant is getting too comfortable," Silas would say, spitting tobacco to the side. "The others look at him like he's something special." Franklin initially paid little attention. Gideon produced well, didn't cause direct issues, and the farm was enjoying a profitable year. But Silas was persistent, and his persistence began to plant seeds of worry in the farmer's mind. A man too big always thinks he can be too big. Silas contended in one of these conversations. You know how it is. When they start thinking they're strong, it gets hard to put them in line later. Franklin nodded thoughtfully. He knew the stories of other farms where powerful enslaved people had become serious problems. Rebellions, organized escapes, even deaths of overseers. It always began this way. A man the others respected too much. The official reason for the punishment was the corn disappearing from the barn. At night, some mothers went there to take handfuls of grain to supplement food for their children. It wasn't greed. It was desperation. The rations distributed by Franklin were calculated to keep people alive and working, but not much beyond that. A mother with a sick child, or a man who spent all day hauling logs, sometimes needed something extra to keep from collapsing from hunger. It was a silent survival system that had operated for years. Everyone knew, including the overseers, but no one spoke openly about it because the quantities were too small to cause real damage. Franklin lost more corn to rats and dampness than to these nighttime visits. But Silas noticed the discrepancy in the measurements and whispered in the boss's ear, "Someone here thinks they can take food from you without paying." Franklin ordered the stores checked. The difference was minimal. Maybe 2 or 3 bags over several months, but the principle had been violated. Someone was stealing, and theft couldn't go unanswered. "Who was it?" asked Franklin, his voice low and dangerous. "I don't know for certain," Silas replied, scratching his chin. "But I'd wager the giant knows. He knows everything that happens there in the slave quarters." It was a lie. Silas had no evidence linking Gideon to the missing corn. But it also didn't matter. He had found the pretext he was seeking. Franklin didn't know who was taking it, and deep down didn't much care. He wanted an example, and if he was going to select someone to humiliate before everyone, let it be the strongest. Get the giant, he decided. If he breaks, the rest break with him. The next morning, Silas arrived at the area where Gideon was working with 4 other men, cutting old logs near the property's edge. The overseer came accompanied by Horace and Ezekiel, all 3 armed with whips and one with a pistol on his belt. "You," said Silas, pointing at Gideon. "Drop that and come here." Gideon placed the axe on the ground slowly, wiped his hands on his worn trousers, and walked toward them. He didn't ask why. He knew that asking would only worsen matters. "Seems like someone's been taking food from the boss," said Silas, his voice drawling and false. "And I think you know who it is." "I don't know anything, sir," Gideon replied, keeping his voice even. "Of course you know," Silas insisted, stepping forward. "Everyone there in the slave quarters tells you things. You're like their king, aren't you?" Gideon didn't respond. He knew that anything he said would be used against him. "Well, since you won't help," Silas continued, smiling from the corner of his mouth, "the boss decided you're going to serve as a lesson anyway. Maybe after a few days on the post, your memory will improve." The other enslaved people stopped working, pretending not to look, but absorbing every word. Everyone knew what a few days on the post meant. "Take him," Silas ordered the other 2 overseers. Horace and Ezekiel approached, whips ready for any resistance. Gideon didn't resist. He knew that if he did, with weapons drawn and witnesses nearby, he would be killed on the spot. He walked between them, head high, broad shoulders tense, but controlled. As they crossed the farm toward the punishment pillory, the other enslaved people paused in their tasks. No one dared look directly, but everyone sensed it. It was as if a shadow had fallen over the entire property. If Gideon, the strongest, was being taken, then no one was safe. Before they put Gideon on the post came the first part of the ritual, the whipping. They took him near the pillory, a thick wooden structure, installed beside the main barn. The pillory had 2 holes in the upper portion where they fastened the victim's wrists, forcing the body to bend forward, fully exposing the back. Silas, with old pleasure in his hand, raised Franklin's favorite whip and began to strike. Back, shoulders, back of the legs. The leather cut the skin with a dry sound, and blood flowed hot, mixing with the dust. Franklin's whip was custom, made with 9 braided leather strips, each ending in a hard knot. When used well, it not only cut the skin but tore pieces from it, leaving deep wounds that took weeks to heal. Once they healed, Silas started slowly, almost ceremoniously. It wasn't haste or fury. It was method. Each blow was calculated to inflict maximum pain without causing immediate death. He knew precisely where to strike to open the skin, where to avoid vital organs, how to vary the angle so the whip strips wouldn't always land in the same place. Gideon clenched his teeth. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction of hearing screams. The muscles in his back contracted involuntarily with each impact, the body trying to protect itself from a pain it couldn't evade. After 10 blows, the skin was already open in several places. After 20, the back was a mass of torn flesh and blood. Silas stopped to breathe, wiped the sweat from his forehead, spat on the ground. He looked at Franklin, who observed everything from a few meters away, seated in a chair one of the enslaved had brought from the big house. "How many more, boss?" asked Silas. Franklin didn't respond immediately. He kept looking at Gideon, assessing. The giant was still standing, still hadn't screamed, still maintained some dignity. This bothered Franklin. He wanted to see that man broken, humiliated, reduced to nothing. 10 more, he finally ordered. Silas smiled and resumed, this time with more force, as if angry at Gideon for still being upright. The blows came faster, more violent. Blood began to run down Gideon's legs, forming small puddles in the dry earth. It was on the 28th blow that Gideon finally let out a muffled groan. It wasn't quite a scream, but it was a sound of pain. Silas smiled even more, satisfied. On the 30th blow, Gideon's legs trembled, nearly giving way. When they finally stopped, Gideon could barely remain on his feet. His legs trembled, breathing came short, vision blurred. The world seemed to spin, and only the wood of the pillory holding his wrists prevented him from falling. It wasn't just cruelty. It was calculation. Franklin knew that a previously beaten man, bleeding with fever and trembling body, would have less chance of escaping after being tied up. The idea was precisely that. Weaken before hanging. Release him, Franklin ordered, getting up from the chair. Horace untied Gideon's wrists from the pillory. Without the support, he immediately fell to his knees, hands seeking support on the ground. Each breath burned. Each movement was pure agony. "Get up," Silas ordered, kicking the side of Gideon's body without much force, just enough to humiliate. Gideon tried to rise, but his legs didn't obey properly. Horace and Ezekiel had to hold him by the arms and drag him more than help him walk. They took him through the farm, passing groups of enslaved people who pretended to work but looked sideways, tense faces, some with tears flowing silently. When they finished, Gideon could barely stand. Still, they dragged him to the center of the corn plantation and tied him to the post, a vertical log with a crossbeam forming a cross, wrists tied with thick ropes, arms open, chest exposed, another rope around the waist, 2 more on the ankles. A human scarecrow, the way Franklin liked to display. The post was in a small clearing in the middle of the plantation, a spot deliberately chosen to be visible from the road that passed about 200 meters away. It was the stage where Franklin exhibited his power, where he transformed people into examples. The ropes were thick hemp, rough, the kind used to tie heavy bundles. Silas had experienced tying people to that post, knew exactly how much pressure to apply, so the ropes wouldn't cut off circulation immediately. After all, the idea was for the victim to survive a few days, but be impossible to loosen. They started with the ankles, wrapping each leg separately against the base of the post. Then the waist, a tight double loop to prevent the body from slipping down. Next, the wrists, forcing the arms to open in the position of the cross, stretched against the horizontal crossbeam. Finally, one last rope crossing the chest, ensuring that even if the others gave way, the body wouldn't fall. 3 days, said the farmer, adjusting his hat, clean, distant from the pain. Maybe 4. Then I'll see if there's still hide left to beat. Franklin took a few steps back, admiring his work as if it were a painting. Gideon hanging there, bleeding, exposed to the sun, was exactly the image he wanted to project. Absolute power, total control, the clear message for anyone passing by the road. This is mine, and I do whatever I want with what's mine. No one brings water, no one brings food, no one comes near. Franklin instructed the overseers. Whoever disobeys goes on the post next to him. The other enslaved people pretended to work between the rows of corn. But everyone knew what was happening. They couldn't look for too long, couldn't cry, couldn't show anything. Only one person stared at the post for more than a few seconds. A thin 12-year-old girl named Lena. Lena was at the edge of the plantation holding a basket of clothes she should have taken to the big house 15 minutes ago. She looked at Gideon, then at Franklin, then back at Gideon. Her eyes were dark and deep, and for a moment seemed too old for the child's face. She saw when Gideon tried to adjust his body, searching for a position that hurt less, and discovered there was none. She saw when he closed his eyes tightly, not against the sun, but against the shame of being there, exposed, an object of lesson. She saw when Franklin spat on the ground next to the post before turning and walking back to the big house, satisfied with the day's work. Then Lena picked up her basket and continued walking. But something in her had changed. A decision was forming, still small and fragile, but real. On the first day, Gideon remained there hanging, feeling the sun open the wounds on his back even more. His mouth dried quickly. Each hour his tongue seemed to turn to stone. In the afternoon it rained a little. That fine rain that doesn't refresh only burns in open wounds. At night the cold wind cut through the sweaty body. It was exactly as Franklin liked it. Slow, silent pain accompanied by fear. The Alabama sun in June is relentless. It starts hot in the morning and grows brutal as it approaches noon. Without a hat, without shade, without anything between skin and sky, it's like being slowly cooked. The wounds on Gideon's back, open and raw, seemed to be on fire every time the sun shone directly on them. Thirst came quickly. In a few hours, Gideon's mouth was completely dry. Tongue sticking to the roof of his mouth, lips beginning to crack. He tried to produce saliva, but there was nothing. The body, already dehydrated from blood loss, simply had no more liquid to spare. Around noon, the flies discovered the wounds. They came in swarms, small and persistent, landing on dried and coagulated blood, exploring each open cut. Gideon couldn't do anything. His hands were tied, and shaking his body only increased the pain of the ropes buried in the flesh of his wrists. The afternoon brought that fine rain. For a few seconds, Gideon felt relief. The fresh water touching the sunburned skin seemed like a blessing. He opened his mouth, trying to capture the drops, managing to wet his tongue a little. But then the rain began to touch the open wounds, and the relief turned into torment. The water mixed with the salt of sweat burned, like acid on the torn back. He clenched his teeth, trying not to scream, jaw muscles so tense they hurt. The rain passed quickly, 15 minutes at most. Then the sun returned, now reflecting on the wet earth, creating a suffocating humidity. The steam rose, enveloping Gideon in a hot and heavy fog that made breathing even more difficult. Between the rows of corn, the other enslaved people worked in heavy silence. No one talked. Even the children were quiet, a type of silence that wasn't natural, that was imposed by fear and sadness. Each person passing near the clearing where the post stood did everything not to look directly, but it was impossible to completely ignore. Gideon was there, visible, a presence that dominated the entire mental landscape of the farm. Silas patrolled the area regularly, making sure no one approached the post. He walked slowly between the rows, whip hanging on his shoulder, looking at each face he encountered, searching for signs of disobedience, of compassion, of any emotion that could turn into a problem. "Keep working," he would say with a dragging voice whenever he stopped near a group. "And remember, any of you could be next on that post. It just depends on how you behave." At night, the temperature dropped drastically. The sweat that soaked Gideon's body during the day now turned to ice against his skin. The June wind in Alabama can be cold, especially after a hot and humid day. Gideon began to shiver, muscles contracting involuntarily, each tremor pulling against the ropes and renewing the pain in wrists and ankles. The fever started around midnight. It wasn't surprising. Between blood loss, dehydration, exposed and infecting wounds, and exposure to the elements, fever was practically inevitable. Gideon's body oscillated between violent chills and waves of heat that made him sweat even more, losing even more liquid he couldn't replace. At some point in the night, he began to hallucinate slightly. He saw shadows moving between the corn, shapes that looked like people but disappeared when he blinked. He heard voices, whispers coming from everywhere and nowhere. His mind, deprived of water, food, and rest, was beginning to disconnect from reality. But even in the confusion of fever and pain, a part of Gideon was still alert. A part of him still resisted, still refused to completely surrender to suffering. It was this part that Franklin wanted to destroy, but it was also the hardest part to break. Lena helped in the kitchen of the big house, carried buckets of water, washed clothes. She was small, went unnoticed by whites, as if she were part of the background of the scene. It was precisely this that made her dangerous. No one remembered to be afraid of her. In the world of the farm, there was an invisible hierarchy, even among the enslaved. Those who worked in the fields were constantly watched, every movement observed, every minute accounted for. But those who worked in the big house, cooks, washerwomen, housemaids, had different mobility. They needed to circulate between the house and the slave quarters, between the kitchen and the storage areas, between the whites' rooms and the service areas. And in this constant circulation, they were sometimes forgotten. Lena was especially forgettable. Small for her age, thin, silent, she had learned from an early age the art of being invisible. When Mrs. Patterson shouted orders in the kitchen, Lena was already complying before the sentence ended. When Mr. Franklin passed through the hallway, she had already pressed herself against the wall, eyes down, small body occupying the minimum possible space. The whites saw her without really seeing her, a useful shadow that did what needed to be done and then disappeared. But this invisibility was power. Lena heard conversations she shouldn't hear. She saw things she shouldn't see. She knew where the keys were, when the overseers changed shifts, which pantry window didn't close properly, which floorboard creaked, and which was silent. She was only 12 years old, but had already learned lessons that many adults took a lifetime to understand. Lessons about observation, about patience, about waiting for the right moment. Lessons about how to steal small things, an extra piece of bread, a handful of salt, a candle, without anyone noticing. Lessons about survival. Lena had first seen Gideon 2 years earlier, when he was still relatively new to the farm. She was returning from the stream with a heavy bucket of water, struggling to carry it without spilling, when one of the overseers, Ezekiel, saw her and decided it would be fun to make her trip. There was no reason, just casual cruelty. Ezekiel was bored, and knocking down a girl with a heavy bucket was enough entertainment for the afternoon. He stuck out his leg in her path, and Lena tripped. The bucket flying from her hands, water spreading on the ground, she falling to her knees. Ezekiel laughed. He was about to make her fetch more water, just so he could knock her down again, when a shadow covered them both. Gideon had appeared, coming from somewhere nearby, perhaps hearing the laughter and coming to investigate. He said nothing. He just stood there looking at Ezekiel. His size was statement enough. Ezekiel stopped laughing. He stood for a few seconds, trying to decide whether he should assert his authority, whether he should send Gideon away, whether he should get the whip. But he was alone. There were no other overseers nearby, and Gideon was very big. So he spat on the ground, grumbled something about getting back to work, and left. Gideon helped Lena get up, took the bucket, and went with her to the stream to get more water. They didn't talk. It was dangerous to talk much, but when he handed the full bucket back to her, his eyes said what words couldn't. "You're not alone." Since then, Lena watched Gideon. She noticed how he helped the weaker ones, how he placed himself between children and overseers, how his eyes, even when lowered, never seemed completely defeated. And when she saw him being dragged to the post, when she saw him being tied up and left there, something inside her, something small but fierce, decided she wasn't going to let him die. On the second night, when the farm's activity decreased, Lena made a decision no child should have to make. She waited for the kitchen to empty, stole a piece of hard bread, took some water from a bucket outside, and left slowly, her heart pounding in her neck. The farm's nighttime surveillance system had patterns, and Lena knew every one of them. Silas usually made irregular rounds, but always started with the barn and stable area, checking if everything was locked. Horace stayed near the big house in the early hours of the night, because that's when Franklin might still be awake and could call him for some task. Ezekiel circulated around the slave quarters and surroundings, but had a predictable route and a tendency to stop to smoke hidden behind the tool shed. Lena waited until she could hear Silas walking in the opposite direction, until she saw Horace's silhouette, standing near the front porch. Ezekiel was in smoking time. She could smell the faint scent of tobacco coming from the direction of the shed. She left through the back door of the kitchen, a cloth wrapped around her waist, where she had hidden the bread, and a small tin cup with water. She walked close to the wall of the big house until she reached the corner, then crouched and waited, breathing slowly, trying to calm the heart that hammered in her ribs. The path to the corn plantation was about 50 meters of open ground, then another 100 meters between rows to reach the clearing where the post was. It was a small distance, but in the dark, with overseers patrolling, it seemed like an impossible journey. Lena began to move. She didn't run. Quick movement attracts attention in the dark. She walked fast but controlled, body low, feet making the minimum possible noise. When she reached the edge of the plantation, she took a deep breath and dove between the rows of corn. There, the darkness was different, denser. The tall plants blocked the little moonlight, creating a corridor of shadows. The ground was uneven, roots and lumps of earth that seemed to want to make her trip. The corn leaves brushed against her dress and arms, making dry sounds that seemed to echo too loud. She walked crouched between the rows of corn, the simple dress brushing against the leaves, feet almost without making noise on the dry earth. Each sound seemed too loud, each shadow an overseer. When she got near the post, she almost backed away. Gideon seemed less human and more a body abandoned to its own fate. Head-hanging eyes almost closed, cracked lips, chest rising and falling slowly. "Gideon, it's Lena," she whispered. He took a while to react. The voice seemed to come from very far away. From a dream, perhaps. Gideon tried to focus his eyes, saw the small silhouette in front of him. Took a few seconds to process that it was real and not another hallucination. When he managed to move his head, he only murmured, "Go away." It wasn't rejection, it was protection. If they caught her there, Lena would be whipped, maybe killed. Gideon didn't want anyone else to suffer because of him. She ignored him. She pressed the bread to his lips. Gideon tried to chew slowly, each bite hurting in jaws locked by dehydration. The hard bread scratched his dry throat, but it was food. It was something beyond pain. Then Lena carefully raised the cup of water to his mouth, supporting his head with her small hand. "Just a little." She spoke softly. "If you make noise, they'll hear." Gideon drank. The water went down, burning in his hurt throat, but it was life. He took a few small sips, each one making his whole body wake up a little more, remembering that he was still alive. "Why?" he managed to whisper. Lena didn't respond immediately. She stood there holding his head with one hand, the cup in the other, her 12 years seeming much older in her dark eyes. "Because you didn't let that man hurt me," she finally said, so low that Gideon barely heard. "And because if you die, everyone here will die a little with you." Then she left in the same silent way she had come, leaving Gideon alone again, but different. Everything still hurt. He was still trapped, could still die there. But now there was something new mixed with the pain. The memory that he was still human, still mattered to someone, was still worth saving. She repeated the ritual on the second night. And the third, always with leftovers from the kitchen, bread, a bit of food, a little water. Each time Gideon seemed to come back a little more into his body. The pain continued, but his eyes, which before were extinguished, began to have some focus again. On the third night, Lena brought not just bread, but a small piece of meat left over from Franklin's dinner. It was mostly fat and tendon, but it had some substance. She had also gotten a handful of salt, which she dissolved in the water, before giving it to him to drink. "You need strength," she whispered while holding his head. "You have to stay strong." "Why?" Gideon asked again, his voice a little less hoarse than the first night. "It'll happen again. When they take me down from here, I'll get beaten more. Maybe die. And if I don't die, there'll be a next time and a next time after that." Lena was silent for a moment. Then she spoke with a strange certainty for a child. "No, it won't. Something is going to change. I don't know what yet, but it will." What Franklin didn't know was that his calculation, whip plus post plus hunger plus thirst, destroyed man, had been slightly altered by a 12-year-old girl. And this small alteration, these few pieces of bread and sips of water, would make all the difference in what was to come. On the fourth day, Franklin decided that at night he would take Gideon down from the post to close the lesson with another whipping. "Today we finish this business," he told Silas while taking a sip of whiskey. "I want that giant to never straighten his back again." Franklin was satisfied. The last 3 days had been a success from his point of view. Gideon was clearly weaker. The whole farm was quieter and more submissive, and even some travelers who passed by the road had commented on the firm control Patterson maintained over his property. Silas was also satisfied. He loved these final beatings, the moment to close the lesson. It was when he could beat someone already completely defenseless with no risk, with the certainty that the man wouldn't even be able to raise his arms to protect himself. "How many lashes this time, boss?" he asked, anxious. 50, Franklin replied, pouring more whiskey. Very slowly to last. Neither he nor the overseer suspected anything. They were used to seeing men come off the post almost dead, carried. They thought Gideon would be just another one. But there was a problem in their calculation. Franklin had planned to leave a man without food or water for 3 days, expecting it to completely destroy him. He hadn't counted on someone daring to disobey and secretly bring food. The 3 nights of bread and water from Lena had created a variable that Franklin didn't know and couldn't predict. Gideon was still very hurt. His back was a mass of infected wounds. Wrists and ankles bled where the ropes cut. Fever still made him shiver, but he wasn't completely destroyed. There was still strength hidden in muscles that hadn't completely withered, fed by pieces of bread and sips of stolen water. But that night, the weather turned. Heavy clouds covered the moon. The wind began to blow strong. The rain thickened. It was the typical night when no white man wanted to be patrolling the field. The storm came quickly, as usually happens in Alabama summer. One moment the sky was clear. The next thunder was rolling on the horizon, and in 15 minutes the rain was already falling heavy. That type of rain that soaks everything in seconds. Franklin looked out the window of the big house, saw the storm forming, and made a decision. "Better leave it for tomorrow morning," he told Silas. "I don't want to get soaked just to beat a man who's not going to run away." Silas agreed, already thinking about his whiskey and his dry bed. The 3 overseers retired. Horace to the cabin he shared with Ezekiel. Silas to his room in the back of the big house. None of them worried about checking on Gideon. Why would they worry? He had been tied up for 3 days without food, without water. Wounded and feverish, he wasn't going anywhere. But Gideon was soaked. Pain made his whole body pulse, and inside him there was something Franklin hadn't managed to break. The will to fight back. He had been since the end of the 3rd day, testing the firmness of the ropes, swinging his body from side to side, taking advantage of each gust of wind to force knots that were already wet and worn. Hemp, when dry, is incredibly strong. But when wet, especially after days of being pulled and constantly forced, begins to weaken. The fibers separate, the knots become looser, and the rope loses part of its resistance. Gideon had noticed this on the 2nd day, when the fine rain had wet the ropes, and he felt a slightly greater flexibility. Not much, but enough to plant an idea. Since then, each time no one was around, he tested, pulled, forced. The rope on the right wrist was the weakest. The more he moved, the more he cut his own skin, but also the more he wore down the fibers. Each pull was a mixture of desperation and calculation. The storm was perfect. The noise of the rain and thunder muffled any sound he made. The torrential water left the ropes completely soaked, and there was no one watching. Who would be crazy enough to stand guard in such a storm? Gideon began to work on the rope of the right wrist, with all the strength he still had. He pulled, twisted, swung his body to create pressure. The skin of his wrist tore even more. New blood mixing with old blood and rainwater, but he ignored the pain. It was pain with purpose. Pain that led somewhere. He spent perhaps half an hour trying, each minute seeming like an eternity. His fingers, numb for days, could barely move. The muscles in his arm trembled with effort and exhaustion. But he didn't stop until, in a combination of strong wind and almost superhuman strength, the rope broke. The pain in his shoulder was so intense that he almost passed out. The arm, stuck in one position for 3 days, suddenly free, caused muscle spasms that cut like knives. But the arm was free, With his trembling hand, he began to attack the rope around his waist, pulling, twisting, squeezing. It took time, seemed like an eternity, but eventually the knots gave way. The left arm came next through more pain and insistence. Finally, he freed his ankles and fell to his knees in the mud, breathing as if coming up from underwater. The fingers of his right hand, now free, were so numb they could barely move. Gideon had to hit his hand against his own leg several times, forcing blood to circulate again. Feeling those painful but necessary tingles as sensation returned. When he finally got some control over his fingers, he attacked the knot at his waist. It was a double knot tightened with force by Silas days before, now swollen and hardened by water. Gideon worked on it with trembling fingers, pulling rope ends, trying to find where the knot began and where it ended. The rain continued to fall heavily, and he worked practically blind, guided only by touch. His fingers bled, nails breaking against the hard fibers of hemp. But he persisted, and finally the knot began to give, then loosened, and then he managed to pull it completely. The waist rope fell. Now he could move, could lean his body to better reach the rope on his left wrist. This knot was faster, perhaps because he was learning, perhaps because he had more angle to work with. In a few minutes, the left arm was also free. The ankles were last. Gideon had to lean completely, almost falling from the post, abdominal muscles screaming in agony after days without moving properly. But he managed to reach the ropes on his feet, and these, carrying less weight, were looser. In a few minutes he had removed them. Any other slave in the conditions Franklin had planned might not have gotten up. But Gideon wasn't completely empty. The 3 nights of bread and water, hidden by Lena, made the invisible difference between a body that faints and a body that can still crawl. He tried to get up, but his legs wouldn't hold. He had been standing or hanging for 3 days straight. Blood wasn't circulating properly. Muscles had forgotten how to function. He fell to his knees in the mud, then forward, supporting himself on his hands. For a few minutes, he just stayed there on all fours, breathing, trying to convince his body to obey. The rain continued to fall, washing away blood and dirt, cold and clean. Slowly, forcing each muscle, Gideon managed to get to his knees. Then, leaning on the very post that had been his prison, he managed to stand. The world spun. He had to close his eyes, breathe deeply, wait for the dizziness to pass. When he opened his eyes again, he looked back one last time at the post, that wooden cross that had tortured so many before him. For a second, he thought about knocking it down, destroying it, but there was no time. He crossed the corn plantation, leaning his body, supporting himself on the stalks, disappearing in the direction of the swamp. He knew of a corner of dense brush where few went. He went there. He fell among roots, breathing with difficulty, body trembling, but alive. The swamp was about 400 meters from the plantation in a low and flooded area that most people avoided. It was dangerous. There were snakes, alligators, quicksand areas that could suck a man down in minutes. But precisely because of this, it was the best hiding place. No one would look for someone there, especially on a stormy night. Gideon walked as far as he could before collapsing. He found a set of large roots forming a kind of natural burrow covered by dense vegetation. He crawled inside, curled up between the roots, and finally allowed his body to rest. The rain continued to fall, but there, partially protected by the roots and foliage, he wasn't completely exposed. He could hear water running somewhere nearby, a stream or creek swollen by the storm. He would have water to drink at least. He closed his eyes, still trembling, still hurting in every inch of his body, but free. For the first time in 3 days, there were no ropes, no post, no one watching him. He could move his arms, could lie on his side, could close his eyes without fear of the sun burning his eyelids. He slept or passed out. It was hard to tell the difference. When he woke up, it was still night, but the rain had stopped. He could hear the silence of the swamp, broken only by occasional sounds of nocturnal animals. And then, even exhausted, even wounded, Gideon began to think. Not about running away directly. Not about saving himself and leaving everyone else behind. He thought about Franklin Patterson, sleeping peacefully in the big house, waking up tomorrow expecting to give the final beating to an already broken man. He thought about Lena, 12 years old, crawling in the dark to bring bread and water. He thought about all the people in the slave quarters, living in fear, knowing that any of them could be next on the post. He thought about Samuel, who had died tied there before Gideon arrived at the farm, and about all the others whose names he didn't know, but whose suffering he knew. And he made a decision that would change everything. The next day, Silas found the post empty, the ropes hanging, knee marks in the mud. He ran to the big house, desperate. Franklin exploded in fury, but deep down felt something he wouldn't admit, even to himself. Fear. How is this possible? He shouted, throwing his whiskey glass against the wall. 3 days without water, without food, beaten. How does a man in those conditions manage to free himself? Silas had no answer. He stood there, hat in hand, trying to find explanations that weren't, "I underestimated him," or "I was incompetent." He can't have gone far. Silas finally said, "A man in that state, injured like that, he must have crawled into the brush and died there. I'll gather the men and look for the body." "The body?" Franklin growled. "You're not going to look for anybody. You're going to find that giant and bring him back here alive. I'm going to make him wish he had died on that post." But searching in the swamp, especially after a storm, was almost impossible. Silas, Horace, and Ezekiel spent the next day sweeping the area, but the terrain was flooded, marks erased by rain, and the brush was too dense to see beyond a few meters. After hours wet and frustrated, they returned empty-handed. Franklin spent the whole day nervous, drinking more than usual, walking through the big house with heavy steps. At night, he ordered the 3 overseers to make extra rounds, to leave lamps lit near the slave quarters and barns, to stay alert. At night, however, fear changed sides. Gideon didn't think about running away directly. Hidden in the brush, waiting for the fever to drop, he gathered within himself the faces of everyone who had gone through the same punishment, the screams he had heard, the children who had seen their father hung on the post. He didn't just want to save his own life. He wanted to break the man who believed himself untouchable. During the day, while the overseers searched for him in vain, Gideon remained hidden, barely moving. He drank water from the stream, ate some roots he knew to be edible, and mainly rested. His body screamed for rest, and he forced himself to obey, even when every fiber of his being wanted to do something, anything. The fever still came and went, but was lighter. The wounds on his back still burned, but had stopped bleeding. The clean water from the stream had helped clean part of the dirt and infection. He wasn't well, not even close, but he was better than Franklin expected him to be. And while he rested, Gideon planned. Lena found him again near the swamp, bringing a little more food. "I thought you had left," she said, whispering. She had heard Silas report to Franklin about the empty post, had seen the farmer's fury. Part of her had hoped that Gideon really had run away, was miles away already. But another part of her, the part that knew him better, knew he was still around. Finding him wasn't difficult. She knew the farm, knew the hidden places, and Gideon, although hidden from the whites, didn't hide when he saw Lena approaching. "Not yet," Gideon replied. "As long as he's there, no one is safe." If I leave now, he'll buy more overseers and hunt you all down for the rest of your lives." Lena understood immediately. It wasn't just about Gideon. It never had been. It was about all of them. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "I don't know yet. But it has to end today. Tomorrow he'll reinforce the guard. He'll bring people from outside. It'll become impossible." She told what she knew. Where the overseers slept, where the weapons were, the times each one patrolled the yard. Franklin's habit of drinking late and sleeping heavily in the living room of the big house. Each piece of information was a piece in a plan that began to form in Gideon's head. Silas sleeps in the back of the big house in a small room near the kitchen, Lena explained. But before sleeping, he always takes one last walk, checks the barns. He almost always stops at the same place near the back fence too, you know. Gideon knew the place. A secluded corner without lighting, protected by a curve in the fence. A place where a man could do his business without being seen. A place where a man became vulnerable. Horace and Ezekiel sleep together in a cabin near the stables. Lena continued, but Horace almost always goes to the barn during the night to steal some whiskey. He hides there. Ezekiel stays in the cabin, usually already half drunk too. And the farmer, he stays in the living room until late drinking. When he finally goes to sleep, it's heavy. I've seen his wife try to wake him in the morning, and it takes several minutes. Gideon absorbed every detail, every piece of information. 3 overseers, 1 farmer, and him. A wounded, feverish man, but determined. The odds weren't good, but they were better than leaving everything as it was. The next night, he returned. He entered the farm from the back using the darkness, the post, storm humidity, and the knowledge he had of the terrain. He knew where Overseer Silas liked to stop to urinate, always at the same corner of the fence. There, behind the fence, Gideon waited, holding a heavy piece of wood torn from an old fence. It was a thick piece, the size and weight of a club, one of the stakes that supported the pasture fence, and had been broken in some past storm. Gideon had found it on the way back from the swamp, recognized its potential, and brought it with him. The night was dark, clouds covering the stars. There was only the light of some distant lamps, creating more shadows than illumination. Gideon crouched behind the fence, breathing slowly, controlling the pain that still pulsed in his body, waiting. He heard the footsteps before seeing the silhouette. Silas walked with that characteristic step, half dragging, making noise on purpose, because he was used to everyone hearing him and moving away. He was alone, as he always was at this hour, relaxed because he thought he was in his territory, safe. When Silas reached the corner of the fence, he turned his back, began to unbutton his pants. It was exactly at that moment when he was most vulnerable and distracted that Gideon rose and attacked. One blow precise to the back of the head. The sound was dry, dull, horrible. Silas fell without time to scream, his body collapsing forward, hitting his face on the fence before falling to the ground. Gideon held the piece of wood, breathing heavily, looking at the fallen body. For a moment, he didn't move, just stood there processing what he had just done. He had just killed a man. There was no going back after that. But then he thought about all the people Silas had tortured, how many he had tied to the post, how many children he had scared, how many women he had abused, and he felt no remorse. He felt justice. Gideon dragged the body into the brush and covered it with leaves. It didn't need to be seen. It was enough to disappear. He took the whip Silas carried on his belt, that same whip that had torn his back, and put it on his own belt. Then he returned to the shadows, waiting for the next opportunity. The other 2 overseers fell that same early morning. One was attracted by a strange noise near the corral. The other was called in a low voice, thinking it was Sela's. Horace had gone to the barn, as Lena had predicted, to get his hidden whiskey. He was leaving, bottle in hand, when he heard a strange sound coming from the corral, as if one of the animals was in danger, or perhaps being stolen. He quickly stored the bottle, grabbed the lantern, and went to investigate. He was still drunk enough not to be careful, sober enough to move. When he entered the corral, the lantern illuminating only a few meters ahead, Gideon was waiting behind the door. He didn't use the wood this time. He was too big, too strong, and Horace, despite his size, were drunk and unprepared. Gideon simply grabbed him from behind. One giant hand covering Horace's mouth, the other twisting his neck with brutal force. Horace tried to fight, his hands clawing backward, trying to scratch, punch, anything, but Gideon was much stronger, and the angle was impossible. In less than a minute, Horace's body went limp. Gideon dropped him to the ground and dragged him to an empty stall, covering him with hay. Ezekiel was the last overseer. He had stayed in the cabin, as Lena had said, already half asleep after drinking. But when Horace didn't return after half an hour, he began to worry. He got up, still dizzy, and left the cabin calling, "Horace, where did you go?" A voice answered from the shadows, roughly imitating Silas's voice. "Over here in the back. Come see something." Ezekiel, still not completely awake, still half drunk, believed it. He walked in the direction of the voice, leaving the circle of light from the lantern he had left in the cabin. When he reached the darkness, a figure moved quickly. Ezekiel had time only to start screaming before a blow from a hoe. The same hoe he had used to make enslaved people work for entire days. Hit his neck. Gideon didn't want to prolong it. He wasn't doing this for pleasure, but out of necessity. A second blow ensured that Ezekiel would never get up again. 3 men dead, 3 instruments of torture removed. It was quick, silent, without speeches, without glory. Just what was necessary. Gideon, even wounded, was still stronger and more prepared for darkness than they were. One died with a broken neck, another with a hoe blow to the neck. Franklin Patterson remained. Gideon returned to the slave quarters and called in a whisper some of the enslaved people he most trusted. Caleb, 2 strong men who had worked beside him in tree felling. Ruth, an old woman with calloused hands and eyes that had seen too much. And 2 mothers who for months had talked about escaping. Lena had already spread among a few that he was alive. Caleb almost fell backward when he saw Gideon appear at the door of the slave quarters. He was sure his friend was dead, maybe still hanging on the post, maybe buried somewhere in the swamp. You're alive?" he whispered, incredulous. "Barely," Gideon replied. "But I'll be dead for real if we don't do something today." He explained quickly. The overseers were dead. Franklin was alone in the big house, unprotected, vulnerable. It was now or never. If they waited until dawn, people from town would come. Reinforcements would appear. The chance would be lost forever. "It's today or never," Gideon said. "If he stays alive here, commanding tonight will become just another sad story. If he falls, everyone leaves." Ruth was the first to agree. "I'm 70 years old," said the woman, voice low but firm. "I saw 4 of my children be sold. I saw my husband die from so much work. I saw too many people hung on that damned post. I won't die without seeing that man pay." The 2 mothers agreed. They had small children, wanted them to grow up free, or at least far from that farm of horror. Caleb and the other men also nodded. Everyone was afraid. It would be impossible not to be. But the fear of continuing to live that way was greater than the fear of trying to change. They surrounded the big house. Lena indicated the back door, which was almost always just pushed closed when Franklin drank too much. That's where Gideon entered with Caleb behind him. The house was silent. They could hear the pendulum clock in the living room, marking the seconds with metallic clicks. Somewhere farther away, they heard someone's heavy breathing, probably Franklin's wife, sleeping in the upstairs bedroom. They moved slowly through the kitchen hallway, passing the pantry, approaching the living room. There was light coming from there, a lamp still lit, and there was Franklin, exactly where Lena had said he would be. Franklin was in the living room, half asleep in a chair, bottle half full, lamp lit on the table. The floor creaked. He raised his head, irritated. "I already told you, Silas, to stop." The sentence died halfway. In the faint light of the lamp, he recognized the silhouette. Gideon, the giant he had seen almost dead on the post, now standing inside the house, facing him. For a moment, Franklin couldn't process it. His brain, dulled by alcohol and years of arrogance, couldn't understand how this was possible. How a man he had personally tortured and left to die was there alive in his living room. "This isn't possible," he stammered, trying to get up. His drunk reflexes were slow, his coordination compromised. He tried to reach for the pistol he always left in a nearby drawer, but Caleb was faster. He came from behind and pushed Franklin back into the chair, one large hand covering his mouth with a cloth. Franklin tried to scream, but the sound was muffled. He tried to fight, but Gideon held his arms with a strength that seemed impossible for someone so injured. It was strength born not of health but of purpose, of anger contained for years, of justice too long delayed. "Quiet," Gideon whispered, his face inches from Franklin's face. "If you scream, she upstairs wakes up. And I really don't want to have to deal with her." 2. He was partially bluffing. He wouldn't hurt Franklin's wife unless absolutely necessary, but Franklin didn't need to know that. They tied Franklin with the same ropes he used in the slave quarters. Wrist by wrist, knot by knot. The same ropes that had held Gideon, Samuel, dozens of others before them. Now they wrapped around the farmer tight enough to cut circulation, to leave marks, to cause pain. Before taking him out of there, Gideon looked at the wall. There hung the farmer's favorite whip. The one with 9 braided leather strips. The one Silas had used on his back. The one that had torn the skin of so many. He took the whip, feeling the familiar weight in his hand. The leather was worn, stained with blood from how many people? 50, 100. Impossible to know. In the yard, under the faint light of the moon and the lamp Caleb had brought, they placed Franklin on his knees. The farmer struggled, eyes wide, chest heaving. For the first time in his life, he was helpless. For the first time, the one on the ground was him. Gideon didn't make long speeches, didn't shout, didn't explain all the reasons, didn't list all the injustices. Actions spoke louder than words, and Franklin already knew every reason to be there. Even if he had never admitted it, he simply raised his arm and returned with the same instrument, a part of what the other had distributed to so many. The first blow was accurate, hitting Franklin's back between the shoulders. The farmer tried to scream, but the cloth in his mouth muffled the sound. His whole body contracted, muscles that had never felt this specific pain discovering it for the first time. The sound of the leather tearing through the air was the same as always. The difference is that this time it wasn't black backs that opened, but those of a white man who believed himself above any pain. Gideon beat methodically, not with pleasure, but with purpose. Not too fast. He didn't want Franklin to pass out too early, but also not unnecessarily prolonging. 10 blows, then 10 more, then 10 more. He screamed, muffled by the gag in his mouth. He felt the skin tear, fire burning each mark. He felt what it was to be powerless, to be reduced to just a body feeling pain, without dignity, without control, without anything but suffering. When the clothes were already torn and blood began to run down his back, Gideon stopped. He didn't prolong it. He didn't turn that scene into a spectacle. He didn't want to make revenge a new ritual, just invert the weight of the past. 30 blows. Less than Franklin had given Gideon, less than he had given many others, but enough. Enough for Franklin to understand viscerally what he had done all those years. Then came the final stage, the post. They took Franklin to the center of the corn plantation, the same place where Gideon had been raised as a scarecrow days before. The post seemed to wait for him, that dark wooden cross stained by time and suffering. In silence, the enslaved people tied him exactly as he tied others. Arms open, ropes tight on wrists, another on the waist, more loops on the ankles, one on the chest to keep the body from slipping. Franklin groaned, breathing labored, trying to move without success. Each movement pulled the open wounds on his back against the rough wood of the post. The wind hit the open wounds from the whipping, bringing that burning pain he had inflicted so many times, but never felt. It was his first real contact with the punishment he had always seen from afar. Caleb and the others worked efficiently, tying each knot carefully, ensuring Franklin wouldn't free himself as Gideon had managed to. These ropes were still dry and would be checked, not because they necessarily wanted to keep Franklin alive, but because they wanted to make sure he stayed there for the necessary time. Gideon stood before him, faced the man who had controlled so many people's lives. His eyes were calm, without hatred now, just cold determination. 3 days without food, without water, he said, his voice low and firm, just like you do to everyone. If anyone takes pity on you, it'll be on their own account. I'm not going to stay to see. Lena watched everything from a few steps back. For the first time in her life, she saw true fear in the eyes of the farmer who treated her as if she were invisible, less than human. Now he saw her. He saw all of them because he no longer had a choice. He won't get bread today, she murmured, remembering the nights she had crawled with food to save Gideon. While Franklin swayed, tied to the post, not understanding how he had lost everything so quickly, the slave quarters were already open. Ruth and the other women gathered the little they had in bags. Men helped the elderly to get up. Children were grabbed and held, half asleep, half scared. There wasn't much to take. Some had an extra blanket, an old knife, a less torn piece of clothing. One of the mothers had a rag doll she had made for her daughter. An old man carried a piece of carved wood, the only thing he had from his father. The plan was simple and dangerous. Follow the trail through the swamp. Avoid the main road where patrollers could see them. Look for shelter among free blacks farther ahead, people about whom there were already rumors of helping fugitives. No one knew if everyone would arrive, but staying there with Franklin alive and commanding was the certainty of dying slowly. But now Franklin was on the post, and there would be no more commands from him, at least not for a few days. And in those days they would be far away. One by one the enslaved people from Patterson's farm left. First the youngest and strongest, who would open the way and check if it was safe. Then the families with children, carrying the little ones who couldn't walk fast. Then the oldest, supported by the younger ones. Last, Ruth, who insisted on being last, wanting to make sure everyone had left. Gideon was the last to leave the plantation. He looked one more time at the post, now occupied by another body. He didn't feel joy, just a strange sensation of provisional balance. The world wasn't fair. One man on the post didn't undo years of injustice, but it was a little less unjust than before. "You gave me life again," he said to Lena as they prepared to enter the brush. "Today I return that to all of you." Lena held his large hand with her small one. She said nothing, just nodded. Some things didn't need words. They disappeared between the rows of corn, then vanished into the darkness of the swamp. Behind them, the farm was silent, without overseers, without slaves, without anyone to work the land. Only a white man hung on the same post he had used his whole life to teach lessons, and a woman sleeping alone upstairs in the big house, still not knowing she had woken up a widow in everything but name. That night the roles were completely reversed. The farmer became a scarecrow, and the scarecrows became people walking, wounded but free, hurting but alive, scared but hopeful toward some form of freedom. Franklin's wife woke at dawn, finding the silence strange. Normally, there was movement early in the morning, enslaved people coming and going, overseers shouting orders, Franklin grumbling about something. But that day, nothing, just silence. She went downstairs, found the living room empty, the whiskey bottle overturned, the chair tipped over. Her heart raced. She called for Franklin, then for Silas, then for anyone. No answer. She went to the window and looked outside. The slave quarters had their doors open, swinging in the wind. There was no one in the fields. The yard was empty. And then she saw, distant but visible, the figure on the post. Wearing clothes, she recognized a body she knew. Her scream echoed through the empty farm, but there was no one to hear except the birds and the wind. Days later, when they found Franklin still alive but broken, when they discovered the bodies of the 3 overseers, when they realized all the enslaved people had escaped, the story began to spread. Some farmers were furious, demanding larger patrols, more severe punishments. Others were scared, looking at their own posts, at their own whips, wondering if they would be next. And among the enslaved people on other farms, the story spread differently. Whispered at night, told with small variations, but always maintaining the core. A giant who didn't break. A girl who brought bread. A post that finally got who deserved it. And 87 people who walked toward freedom. The truth is that not all 87 reached safe places. Some were captured after weeks. Others died on the way from hunger, disease, or patroller bullets. But many succeeded. Many found refuge, rebuilt lives, had children who were born free. And for those who in the future heard the story of that farm, the corn plantation would never be just a work field. It would be the place where an entire system cracked because a giant didn't break in a 12-year. Old girl decided to bring bread and water in secret. It would be remembered as the place where for one night justice spoke louder than law, and where scarecrows became people, and people became scarecrows, and nothing remained as it was before.